Sreekumar is an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a gold medalist for MA Philosophy from the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. He did his MPhil and PhD in philosophy from the Central University of Hyderabad and specializes in the areas of philosophy of language, continental philosophy and hermeneutics. He has been into the academic profession since 1995 and is taught in Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala and BITS Pilani, Rajasthan before joining the IIT Madras in 2003. Dr. Sreekumar has published articles in various journals and has presented papers in national and international seminars. Some of the courses he offers include European Philosophy, Contemporary German Philosophy, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Philosophical Hermeneutics, Philosophy and Critical Theory, and Philosophy of Language.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in philosophy on Phenomenology and Existentialism, part 42. The previous couple of previous episodes we have been discussing the philosophy, the phenomenological position of the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty. So, we will be continuing with the discussion on the same topic in this episode as well. The present episode will be focusing the following topics: the conception of body, because Merleau-Ponty has a very unique conception of body. He calls it body subject. This is drastically different from the traditional view where body is conceived as an object and the mind is invariably conceived as the subject, particularly in the epistemological traditions of modern philosophy in rationalism and empiricism. Contrasting to these positions, Merleau-Ponty adopts a very unique position which says that, which argues for a body subject. So, we will very briefly see this in this episode because the primary concern of this episode is different. So, this issue appears in a prominent way in the following episode, but I have to introduce this for the sake of continuity. Criticism of empiricism and intellectualism. So, this episode I have been mentioning about this intellectualism and empiricism and the criticism raised by Merleau-Ponty on these traditions in the previous episodes as well. There have been repeated references on this empiricism and intellectualism. So, I will be explaining what are these schools of thought or what are these traditions upholding about perception, knowledge and other things. And also we will be briefly examining Merleau-Ponty's criticism of these positions, these traditional views. Again, the nature of perception according to Merleau-Ponty. So, we will explore this aspect as well. And now let us start with the conception of body, as it is rooted in the traditional understanding, because the traditional philosophy has a very strong notion of body, and particularly if we start our focus from modern philosophy, from Descartes onwards, how he had conceived body. After proving the existence of the thinking mind, he conceptualizes, or he says that there is a body, the material world, the physical world exists, and he proves the existence of physical world after proving the existence of God. So, there is a continuity in that, and finally the existence of body or the material world has been proved. So, body has been always identified with the world, the objective world. So, body is an object. So, this metaphor, body as an object, is predominantly present in the Western philosophical traditions. Criticism of empiricism and intellectualism becomes relevant in this context in a major way, because these two traditions I have already mentioned to rationalism and again empiricism. So, these two traditions he categorizes them as empiricism and intellectualism have diverse different conceptions of body, different conceptions of knowledge, different conceptions of perception and human understanding. So, we will examine these positions first and then go to try to understand how Merleau-Ponty attacked these positions. Empiricist theories of perception. Let us have a look at this one first. So, in the empiricist theories of perception, sensation is a unit of experience. So, I have examined, I have briefly mentioned this in the previous episode, how John Locke, the supposed to be the founder of British empiricist philosophy, he explained, or he rather defined knowledge as the perception of the ideas, agreement or disagreement between ideas. And what is perception? How does the mind get ideas? What are the sources from where the mind get ideas? To this he says that there are two major sources, sensations and reflections. I am not touching upon reflections at present, but sensation is a very important concept. It is a paramount notion in the empiricist tradition as a whole. So, sensation as a unit of experience has been conceived by the empiricist philosophers in a major way. Then again, sensation is a purely qualitative element. So, the way in the role which sensation plays in empiricist tradition testify this, it is purely qualitative element. And then the subject, again the subject of experience, the mind, coincide with it without the mediation of thought. So, there is a direct interaction, or rather a direct encounter with sensations by the human mind without any mediation of thought. So, this presupposition lies at the center of empiricist epistemology. The human mind encounters the sensations directly, and each sensation occur independent of others. This is another very important notion as far as the empiricist conception of knowledge is concerned, that we get knowledge through sensations, number one, and number two, each sensation is independent of others. So, there is a kind of atomism that is presupposed. Sensations are independent of each other, and again the qualitative nature of each sensation is independent. So, there is absolute independence, each sensation is independent of the other, and again this leads to a kind of, it is a form of, this is to advocate a form of atomism. And this atomism, this feature of atomism is a characteristic feature of empiricist epistemology, which is countered by Merleau-Ponty. Now, let us see the Critic of Empiricism initiated by Merleau-Ponty. Experience gives us no reason to think that any such thing as sensation exists. So, he is abandoning, or rather he is denying the atomistic presuppositions or the atomistic assumptions completely, and he says that experience as a whole, because we get knowledge through experience. So, when we analyze our experience as a whole, it does not give any reason, there is no reason to think that any such thing as sensations exist, which are independent of each other, which are directly encountered by the mind without any mediation of human thinking. So, what are those entities called sensations? So, he wonders, and again what we perceive is never purely qualitative, that is another thing, we perceive various other things as well. So, now again according to Gestalt psychology, perception exhibits the structure of figure and ground. See, this is a very important feature, because Merleau-Ponty takes a lot of insights from the existing psychological schools like Gestalt psychology and various other psychological experiments that was prevalent to explain the notion of perception. Actually, this whole exercise is to clarify what perception is, because these are all taken from his book Phenomenology of Perception, which is a monumental work by Merleau-Ponty. So, here he talks about the problems, or rather he points out some of the problems with the empiricist conception of experience. Objects of perception are perceived as standing out against a ground, and the ground as running on behind the figure. So, you are approaching perception not atomistically, but as a whole in human experience, the objects stand out against a ground, and the ground as such is running on behind the figure. So, this is what it appears when you look at an object. See, for example, I look at the camera which is placed in front of me, there are various other things in this room which is part of my perceptual field. I can see them if I want, if I place some more attention on that object, I can actually see them. But now at present, when I look at this particular object called camera, it stands out against a ground, and the ground is running behind the figure. Now, the object belongs to the ground, actually it is a part of that, only thing is that I attend on it, I focus my attention on it. So, I could see that as if it is standing out. So, this points to the intentionality aspect, the element of intentionality which about which every phenomenologist is deeply concerned. Objects form a system in which one cannot show itself without concealing others. So, to see this camera, I have to necessarily, I mean, there is an element of concealing other objects which are there in the background. So, objects form a system in which one cannot show itself without concealing others. It belongs to that, but in order to show itself to me. So, this is another important aspect of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, that the world is given to consciousness, or the world is given to the mind, to the being. And here, in order for an object to be given to the human mind, to the human consciousness, it has to conceal others, because it necessarily belongs to a field, a ground, where it has to stand out so that it can give itself to consciousness for understanding, for perception. So, this is a quote from Phenomenology of Perception. I read it, quote, "In normal vision, I direct my gaze upon a sector of the landscape which comes to life and is disclosed, while the other objects recede into the periphery and become dormant, while however not ceasing to be there. To see is to enter a universe of beings which display themselves, and they would not do this if they could not be hidden behind each another or behind me." So, there is this aspect of a particular object standing out and presenting itself to the mind for perception is highlighted by Merleau-Ponty. So, this in a sense points to the importance of the figure ground structure to which the object belong. So, this figure ground structure is the object horizon, the horizon to which the object belong, and it is a figure ground structure, and the existence of perspective is a constitutive condition of there being a world for us. I read it once again, the figure ground structure and the existence of perspective from where I see it is a constitutive condition of there being a world for us. So, for there being a world for us, this is very important. The intentionality principle again comes into prominence. Perception is always a whole, not atomism. So, perception is always of whole. So, you perceive the entire thing, there is a figure ground structure, but the object stands out. So, it is not atomism that we get when I perceive this camera from the perspective of atomistic epistemology. They would explain that there is a particular shape, a particular patch of color standing out from other things, which we have examined in the previous episode, how when we compared Merleau-Ponty's position with Price's position, who is who belongs to the analytical philosophy, tradition of analytical philosophy. So, it is characteristically different from that. Here he argues that, or he asserts that perception is always of wholes. The empiricist notion of the unit of experience is a result of abstraction. So, there is no concept, we cannot, as the empiricist would argue that there is a unit of experience. They call sensation a unit of experience and isolate it, abstract it from other units, and they would say that sensations come to human mind one after the other. So, this is the Lockean, the famous Lockean conception of how the human mind forms complex ideas out of simple ideas. One by one these ideas are composed, combined, and finally the mind frames a complex idea. So, the atomistic epistemology and the atomistic presuppositions of knowledge are all being denied by Merleau-Ponty. The reassertion of the role of the intentional aspect in perception. So, this is what I have pointed out. This would actually assert the role intentionality plays in perception. I have been discussing about the role of intentional aspect in perception, and this would become clearer if you understand perception as an existential act. So, Merleau-Ponty understands perception as an existential act which belongs to a person, a body to which the world is given and the objects are given in perception. Now, again there is an element of recognition because when we perceive something we recognize an object as something. We recognize a square as a square, a triangle as a triangle. So, this element which is built in within the structure of perception is very important. So, probably this element is something which the empiricist tradition fails to give an account for, satisfactory account for. So, that is what he says, that the empiricism fails to provide an account for recognition, the aspect of recognition, and it tries to give an account in terms of causal mechanism. So, always this causal explanation model is inbuilt within the empiricist tradition. So, when it tries to explain anything, for example recognition in this context, it goes back, or rather it points to the causal mechanisms and tries to explain it. Recognition is a meaningful perception, presupposes that perception is guided by a consciousness. So, this is what Merleau-Ponty says. So, you cannot explain recognition in terms of causal mechanism because it is a meaningful perception, and it presupposes that perception is guided by a consciousness. So, somewhere you will find that these are the issues which the empiricist, or rather the rationalist, had with the empiricist. So, Merleau-Ponty too involves in a dialogue with these philosophers on such issues. Now, let us come to intellectualism, which is from the very outside intellectualism looks, or rather it provides an opposite view of empiricism, and it is perception is a rational process and not something that arises out of merely causal processes, which is the view of empiricism. So, it provides a contrasting picture. It is a rational process, it is not just a mechanical process where you encounter sensations one after the other, but rather it is a rational process which does not occur out of causal processes. Again, it is part of the logical processes which give rise to knowledge of the world. So, it is a logical process which ultimately gives you knowledge about the world. Then again, it emphasizes the rules that consciousness follows in constituting objects. The human consciousness actually constitutes objects on the basis of certain rules. So, intellectualism as a whole emphasizes these rules, the importance of these rules. They are very central for any perception, for any knowledge. They actually make the world, that is their view, which is just the opposite of empiricism as it is understood in this context. And again, objects of perception are constituted by thought. This is what I have just explained. The thought plays a very important role. We could see the rationalist traditions and even to some extent the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, though he recognizes the importance of sensations as well, he too emphasizes the importance of the mind with a pre-structured mind, rational mind, and for them, for the intellectualism, attention and judgment are central for perception. So, they understand that these attention as well as judgment are part of any perceptual act. Now, let us see the Critic of Intellectualism initiated by Merleau-Ponty. It criticizes the overemphasis on attention and judgment, because once you start emphasizing attention and judgment, what ultimately happens is that you lose out the experiential counterpart, or rather that which the objective counterpart. Then it becomes pure idealism, everything comes from within, but there is something which gives to the mind. The world is actually given to the mind. So, there is a world which gives itself to the mind. That aspect is being ignored by intellectualism. Attention discovers objects as intelligible structures, and hence there is nothing indeterminate in consciousness. So, this is a problem. He identifies that since attention discovers objects as intelligible structures, there is nothing indeterminate in consciousness. So, you know everything in advance, there is nothing indeterminate about it, which is not the case. Consciousness does not begin to exist until it sets limit to an object. Thus, consciousness of objects does not involve any kind of passage from indistinctness to clarity. So, this is his criticism, if you follow the intellectualism, the views of intellectualism, then there is no, the consciousness of objects does not involve any kind of passage from indistinctness to clarity, which is not the case. Actually, in every perceptual endeavor, there is a stage where things are not clear, things are indeterminate, and from there we gradually move to clarity. So, this movement, this transformation from indistinctness to clarity is not being explained by the intellectualism. So, Critic of Intellectualism, again we actually experience attention as a transformation of the mental field. So, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes this aspect, the transformation of the mental field, a passage from the indeterminate to the determinate, and attention brings to light its object, which is created through the act of attention, and the act of attention again here refers to a kind of intentionality. So, attention brings to light its object. The intellectualist confuses the result of the act of attention as beginning. So, this is the problem with intellectualism. They confuse us the result of the act of attention as the beginning of the act of attention. Actually, it is a result. We get clarity, we get a completeness after the process is done, but for intellectualism believes that it is the beginning. So, that is the problem with intellectualism. Now, again about judgment. Judgment, according to Merleau-Ponty, judgment is a logical act. Intellectualism or intellectualist assimilates perception to judgment. Again, it equates perception with judgment, which is not correct. Perception is not judgment. So, for the intellectualist, that is what I have pointed out in the previous slide, that it assumes that the end result as the beginning. This is incorrect, as perception is not a logical act. Again, when we talk about empiricism and intellectualism, we have presented these two traditions as contrasting positions, but actually they share a lot. There are a lot of commonalities, and Merleau-Ponty is particularly concerned about these common aspects, these common features of both the traditions, empiricism and intellectualism. There is a world, for example, both assume that there is a world perfectly explicit in itself, which exists in totally independent of the mind. There is no confusion about it. Number 2, again the existence of this world is presupposed and the perception is a secondary and derivative phenomena. So, there is something which is already there, out there to be discovered, and we go from here to perceive it. So, perception becomes a derivative phenomena. Now, empiricism, the world to exist of itself, perception mediates our contact with it. The world exists, but we perceive, perception mediates our contact with it. For intellectualism, world exists by virtue of thought, and perception merely retrieves what has already been put there by the intellect. So, in any case the role of perception is somewhat inferior, somewhat derivative. In the case of empiricism, it mediates perceptions, and perceptions mediate between us and the world, and in the case of intellectualism, the world exists by virtue of thought and perception merely retrieves what is already there. So, Merleau-Ponty very strongly argues against this. He criticizes these positions. The world that is primordially presupposed is the perceived world, according to him. It is a perceived world, and here there is a quote from Phenomenology of Perception. Empiricism and intellectualism dissolve the perceived world into a universe which is nothing but this very world cut off from its constitutive origins. See the last phrase, the world cut off from its constitutive origins. So, they actually dissolve the perceived world into a universe which is nothing but this very world cut off from its constitutive origins. Again, existence of a world perfectly explicit in itself, the idea of an absolute determining being, which I have already indicated. Again, the mutual exteriority of parts of the world, objects in the world are external to and independent from one another. So, there is a kind of atomism here too, to both subscribe to by both empiricism and intellectualism, and Merleau-Ponty says that elements of the perceived world have blurred boundaries and are internally connected. So, he argues for this internal connection. The internal connections between perceived objects are neither logical nor causal, but relations of expressions and meaning, and who gives the meaning? That is the problem. There lies the role of intentionality, we give the meaning. So, it is nothing to do with, they are not logical connections, nor do they belong to a causal network, but they are, the relations between objects are expression, but relations of expression and meaning. And for both, this is another aspect which we have already examined, for both empiricism and intellectualism there is no indeterminacy into the world. Merleau-Ponty says that indeterminacy is a real part of the perceived world. There is indeterminacy, we go from indeterminate to the determinate, and here there is a need to examine perception and sense experience. So, phenomenology becomes relevant in this context. So, actually he starts, the entire project starts with the criticism of these two dominant traditions which have studied perception in detail, human experience in detail, and now Merleau-Ponty introduces his phenomenology to propose a counter view. Here is another quote: phenomenology has to revive perceptual experience which has been buried under its own results. The task of philosophy is descriptive rather than explanatory or analytical. So, phenomenology for him should be descriptive, not analytical or exploratory. Now, with this we will wind up this episode. Before that, let us summarize the topics which we have examined in this present episode. The criticism of empiricism and intellectualism, this is the dominant issue which we have discussed in the present episode. We have seen the various aspects of it. Again, the empiricist theory of perception has been explained in detail, and we have seen how the problems which such a theory of perception encounters according to Merleau-Ponty. The phenomenon of attention and judgment comes into picture in this context. The role of philosophy and phenomenology. So, these are the topics which we have covered in this present episode. Now, we can think of some questions from this episode. Number 1, explain the features of the empiricist theories of perception, some of the very important features which we have examined. Second one, explain the notion of perception according to intellectualism. And finally, number 3, empiricism and intellectualism conceive perception as a derivative phenomena. Explain. With this we will wind up this episode. Thank you.